of urine in such patients, and he called it madhumeh. Right? The Hindi word for diabetes is madhumeh. So what exactly is diabetes? So diabetes is a group of metabolic diseases which is characterized by hyperglycemia, and hyperglycemia means increase in blood glucose levels. Right? You break the word, hyper is increased, glycemia is glucose. So it is characterized by hyperglycemia resulting from either defect in insulin secretion, either there is defect in insulin action, or there's a combination of both. Fine. So where does this term arrive from? It's a combination of a Greek and a Latin word. In Greek, the word diabenin means to siphon or to pass through something, and the Latin word meditis means sweetened with honey. So when you combine it together, it means to pass through sweetened with honey. Fine. So that is where the origin of this term diabetes mellitus comes from. Now we will touch upon urine analysis for diabetes. What is its importance? What is its significance? And when it should be done. Right. So just going through a recap of urine analysis that you all have done in your practical classes as well. So I will be answering your questions, and I want all of you to be very interactive in the chat box and answer all the questions. Fine. So urine analysis, when we do it routinely, it's called urine routine and microscopy. When you all become interns and become PGs and residents and consultants in future, you will order investigations. So it's not urine analysis, it's urine RM, which is a routine investigation. Fine. So what is it? It's an array of tests. That is, it's a series of tests that is performed on a patient's urine sample. And what all do we test in it is physical tests, chemical testing, and microbiological testing. Fine. So what are the indications of urine analysis? This comes as a short note in your exam also, in your theory. This is also a practical Viva question that is asked. Fine. So with respect to, we'll concern ourselves with diabetes today. So the indications of urine analysis are in cases of suspected renal diseases, fine, like nephrotic syndrome, pyelonephritis, glomerulonephritis, renal failure, etc. Obviously, because urine gives a very important clue as to what is happening with the kidney. Fine. For detection of urinary tract infection, again, urine analysis is important. In our scenario today, the case that we're discussing, it is important for detection and management of metabolic disorders like diabetes mellitus. For differential diagnosis of jaundice, for detection and management of plasma cell disorders and dysplasias like multiple myeloma, you all must be aware, the M band which comes, and for diagnosis of pregnancy, obviously you all know urine pregnancy test which detects beta hCG in urine. Fine. So this is another minor question that is asked from all of you. So we'll pertain ourselves to what is necessary for us today. Common thing is a random sample, but it's the least preferred sample. Right? The second is the first specimen voided in the morning. Now this is the most preferred specimen. Can anybody tell me why this is the most preferred specimen? Please be interactive. You may be wrong, but you must learn the right thing, Abhi. Urine is collected overnight. That is a 24-hour, that is partly correct, that is a 24-hour urine sample, but what I'm asking here is, why the first specimen that is voided in the morning is the most preferred sample for doing urine analysis? That is my question. Why is the first specimen that is voided in the morning, that is most important? Overnight secretion is maximum. For what? You are getting to the right thing, Rehmat, but I want you to think more on the lines of why the first specimen is collected. You are going in the right direction. It is the most concentrated form. Yeah, correct. Anything else? Somebody else wants to add? Why you guys so like dhila today? Please, bharo yaar. I wanted to be very interactive. You guys have done it. not teaching something new. Why are other people not participating? Only 2-3 people are answering. Chalo. The first specimen voided in the morning is the preferred sample because overnight, yeah, you people were right. Overnight, all the casts and everything, they are excreted in the first morning sample. Even for detection of proteins and glucose, this sample is preferred. Fine. The other thing was 24 hours urine sample. Now, 24 hours urine sample has another significance. It gives us a quantitative. It is used for quantitative estimation. That is, you quantify how much of proteins, how much of sugars, how much of electrolytes, and how much of hormones. Even hormonal excretion in urine, which you read in kidney, like pheochromocytoma, metanephrin, and everything. That is all quantitatively estimated in a 24-hour urine sample. So how do you collect a 24-hour urine sample? We've taught you this in practical, so I want you to answer in the chat box. How is a 24-hour urine sample collected? The interactive people, urine is collected in a big bottle for a whole day. It is collected for the whole day in a big bottle, obviously, because your daily excretion is 1.25 liters approx. Okay. Instead of first morning sample, collect all the samples then for 24 hours. Yeah, so Sheetal, you are correct. First morning urine is discarded and the rest of the whole sample is collected. Good, Khyati, you also mentioned it correctly. So the first morning sample that is voided is discarded. After that, whatever urine the patient passes, he is told to collect that in a bottle, in a big bottle, a 2-liter bottle preferably, and he has to collect it and he has to include the first morning voided sample of the next day. Fine. So you got my point. So this is a Viva question which you all must be very clear with. How you guys will become interns and you'll order patients key. You have to collect 24-hour urine samples. You'll have to tell the patient everything regarding this key. You'll have to discard the first morning sample and collect everything beyond that, including the next day's first morning sample. Fine. Okay. And with pertaining to our case, 2 to 3 hours after eating, that is done for glycosuria. Now we'll come to that later. Fine. Now physical examination of urine. Now you guys tell me what is the normal volume of urine that is excreted. This is all been done in your practicals. Fine. So I want all of you to be very interactive now. Like these are Viva questions, MCQ questions, everything. What is the volume of normal urine? Normal volume of urine excreted? 800 to 2000 ml. 800 to 2500. I want more answers. Come on. Only 2-3 people are answering. I want some more answers. Okay, yeah, fine. So you guys are correct. It's between 600 to 2000 ml in 24 hours. Fine. So what is polyuria? Can you define? What is polyuria? More than 2.5 liters. Fine. Anybody else? Yeah. Increased frequency of urination, but there is a standard definition to call it polyuria. So when do you call a patient that he has polyuria? Yeah. So most of you have written the answer correctly. It's more than 2000 ml per day. Fine. And then what is oliguria on the other hand? Just to clarify all points so there is no confusion, what is oliguria? How is oliguria defined as? Yeah, Sheetal, good. It's less than 400 ml in 24 hours. Yeah, very good, Khyati. Good, Ansh. A lot of people are answering now. Yeah, fine. Now, if oliguria is less than 400 ml, what is anuria? Less than 100 ml, less than 100 ml. Good. Okay, yeah. So good, you all have answered it correctly. It's less than 100 ml in 24 hours, or there is absolute cessation of passing of urine. Okay. So even if there's absolutely no passage of urine, you call it anuria, and if it's less than 100 ml, still you call it anuria. Fine. The other thing is color, which we all know. The odor. What is the normal odor of urine? Does it have a smell or no? Ammonical. Ammonical understand. Yeah, correct. It is ammonical. Why? Because we excrete urea in that. Fine. So, what happens when there is presence of ketones in urine? Does it still smell ammonical? Fruity. Yes. So you guys are right. It becomes a fruity smelling when there's presence of ketone. Okay. Now the other thing is specific gravity. So what is the normal specific gravity of urine? Okay, Anish has answered. Some more answers. Okay, so most of you are correct. The normal value of specific gravity of urine is 1.003 to 1.030. Fine. Yeah. Dhruv has written exactly the correct value. Okay. Okay. What are the conditions in which specific gravity can increase? Like common conditions? Diabetes, very good. Any other conditions? Like very common conditions. Proteinuria, diabetes, albuminuria, nephrotic syndrome, good. And dehydration, excellent. So, the conditions in which specific gravity increases, which you guys have to answer, is first is diabetes mellitus, second is nephrotic syndrome, third is dehydration, and fourth is fever. Fine. When the patient has fever, the specific gravity of urine increases. Okay, let's proceed now. Now, the chemical analysis that we do for urine includes tests for proteins, sugars, ketones, which you guys do in the lab as well, bile salts, which you must have done in biochemistry, bilirubin, hemoglobin, and myoglobin. Fine. So, tests for sugar. Now, we all have done this in the lab. This is Benedict's test. The principle of Benedict's test is you all know it. It's mentioned on the slide, and this should be on your tips. It's a theory question, it's a viva question. It will be asked to you later also. It's a entrance exam question also. So, what happens is the blue color citric ions, when they are added with the reducing sugar, in the presence of heat and alkali, it turns to cuprous oxide, which is the red, and cuprous hydroxide. Fine. So the grading is based on the color. Now tell me, the grading of Benedict's test is done on the color of what? What do we see the color for? In Benedict's test, I'll repeat my question. In Benedict's test, the color of batch is seen to grade the presence of reducing sugars in the urine sample. So most of you have written the correct answer. We see the color of the precipitate. So that is why whenever you do the practical in the lab, we tell you to heat the solution. When the color changes, we tell you to keep it for 5 minutes and then see the color of the sediment. So the grading is done accordingly. You must be all familiar with this grading. Blue is no reducing sugars present. Green is trace. Brown is 2+. Yellow, orange is 3+. And brick red is 4+. Fine. So this is what we do in the lab. But what do we do in our hospitals, in our wards, in big private hospitals? So I'll tell you that we do this reagent strip test. Okay. So this is done practically for all purposes. We don't heat urine samples of patients. So it comes in a box like this, and it has multiple tests. So this is what the strip looks like. Fine. So you dip it in, and whatever you want to test for, you see that according, and this label, this colored label, which I have mentioned, shown as a bigger diagram over here, is there for reference to see how much sugar is present. So basically, what the principle of this test is, this is basically a glucose oxidase peroxidase test, if anybody asks you. So what happens is, glucose, when it combines with oxygen in the room air, and in the presence of glucose oxidase, it converts to gluconic acid. Fine. And in the stage 2, what happens is there is hydrogen peroxide plus a chromogen which is added to this reagent strip test. So in the presence of peroxidase, it gets converted to an oxidized chromogen. So what happens here is, as I've circled this red, you can see in the bottom, we dip the patient's, we dip this strip. It comes in a black box like this. There's a lot of strips there. So we take out one strip, we dip it in patient's urine, which is collected in a container. Fine. We wait for 60 seconds. There's time limit given here. Fine. There's 60 seconds we wait. After that, we see what the color changes, and then we grade it. Like yellow is normal, orange is 100 milligrams per deciliter, brick red is 300 milligrams per deciliter, and then the crimson red is 1000 milligrams per deciliter. So that this is an easy way, and that this is what practically is done in wards and hospitals to do it. Even when you become interns, you'll have to do this on patients, and you'll see how it's done. Fine. Now test for proteins. This is what we do in our lab, the heat and acetic acid test, boiling test. Now tell me, why do we heat only the upper portion of the test tube in this? I'll repeat my question. Yeah. Why do we heat only the upper part of the test tube when we do the heat and acetic acid boiling test for proteins? Why don't we heat the bottom of the tube like we do it in Benedict's test? Why do we only tell you to heat the upper part? If we heat the lower part, then heat will reach upper part by convention. Yeah. So most of your the upper part acts as a control in this. Sorry, the lower part acts as a control. The upper part is the test. Fine. Correct. So most of you are right here. So this is how it looks like. This is an actual image. You can see the upper part of the test tube. It's cloudy. The lower part is clear. This is presence of proteins in the urine. And how do we distinguish whether this turbidity or this cloudiness is due to phosphates or it is due to proteins? What do we do for that? So you all know that this cloudiness can either be because of proteins or can either be because of phosphates. Fine. So to differentiate it, most of you have written correctly, we add a few drops of acetic acid. Now what happens if we add a few drops of acetic acid? If the turbidity is due to phosphates, the cloudiness dissolves, it disappears. Fine. That is how you differentiate it. Okay. Now again, what is practically done is a reagent strip test. Again, as I told you, all these are separate tests for different things. But then for protein, this is the grading that is given. This is the color change that you see. So again, the strip is taken out of this box. It is dipped in the patient's urine. We wait for 60 seconds. We notice the color change, and then we grade accordingly. And the advantage of this is it's a semi-quantitative estimation. So instead of just getting 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus values, you get approximately how much milligram per deciliter of proteins is present in this case. Fine. Now test for ketones. This you've done in your lab, and I hope all of you get a good nitroprusside ring and not a gola that you guys do. अच्छे से practice किया होगा. But this is the amount of urine that you have to take, and this is what a positive test looks like. Can you see this ring? This is what it looks like. So what happens here is, we all know what are the ketones. Ketones, 3 ketones we know, fine. So ketones are formed why? Because three fatty acids are utilized, and it leads to acetyl CoA, then it forms acetoacetic acid, then beta hydroxybutyrate, and so on and so forth. Now tell me, in the urine test for ketones, which of these following ketone bodies is not detected? I'll repeat my question. Which of the ketone bodies is not detected in a urine test? I have given you 3 names, fine. Acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyric acid, and acetone. Which of these is not detected in a urine test? This is again a Viva question. Can I get some more answers? And I'll tell you what the answer is. So what happens here is, the ketone body that is not detected in the Rotheras sodium nitroprusside test that we do is acetone. Why? Because acetone is volatile. It evaporates. It's not present in urine. You guys have written beta hydroxybutyrate, but that is detected. Acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate are the 2 ketone bodies which are detected in urine. In fact, it is acetone because it's volatile, it evaporates. That is what leads to a fruity smell in the urine, and therefore it is not detected. Clear? Chalo, next. Now there is importance for urine ketones in diabetes. Because we're discussing diabetes, I'll tell you why. Diabetes at the time of diagnosis of diabetes mellitus, I'm talking about type 2 diabetes here. At the time of diagnosis, it's very important that you do a urine ketone for your patient. Also, at regular intervals, whoever is a known case of diabetes through whatever time period before has to do a urine ketone regularly. Also, in cases of gestational diabetes. Now, what is gestational diabetes? Gestational diabetes is diabetes which develops after 20 weeks of gestation, that is after approximately 5 months of gestation. There is carbohydrate intolerance in the body. So, during the period of pregnancy, this woman develops carbohydrate intolerance. That is gestational diabetes. That is similar to diabetes mellitus. Fine. So these patients also need strict monitoring. Now the most important thing is, in a known diabetic patient, whenever this patient has an acute illness, or whenever this patient has persistent hyperglycemia, for any reason, for example, his diabetes is not controlled, he has forgotten to take in his medicine, he has had a carbohydrate-rich diet, for whatever be the reason, if there is persistent hyperglycemia, if he has an acute illness, or if the patient is pregnant, or if there are symptoms of diabetic acidosis in a patient, then it is must to do a urine ketone. Fine. Now we come to a clinical case. So I want you all to read carefully. Each and every word has a significance in this case. So there's a Mr. X, a 45-year-old alcoholic male, who is presenting to the medicine OPD with complaints of blurred vision since 3 days, increased thirst since 2 weeks, fatigue since 2 weeks, frequent urination since 1 month, increased hunger since 1 month, unintended weight loss, which is evident to him by loosening of his clothes. Fine. His past history is not significant, and in the family history, he has a history of diabetes mellitus in his father and his uncle. I hope you've read this very carefully. What is the most likely diagnosis that you can think of after a patient has given you this history? Imagine you are an intern or you are a PG or you are a consultant sitting in the medicine OPD. A patient comes to you, exactly same history. What is the first thing that strikes your mind? What lines would you like to think? What all? Because that will define what all investigations you like to do in this patient. Come on, I want some answers. It was a very precise history. Okay, I'm getting good answers. I want some more. The history was very classical. If you want, I can go back to the history page. This was the history. Now I want some more answers. 45-year-old, alcoholic. Look at the complaints the patient has. Look at his family history. Yeah, so most of you are right, thinking along the lines of diabetes. Now, when we examine this patient, imagine that you are the medicine consultant who's sitting in the OPD, and you have examined this patient. His pulse rate is 88, his BP is 135/86, his respiratory rate is 15, pararictus cyanosis clubbing, lymphadenopathy, edema, everything was absent. CVS absolutely normal, respiration normal, per abdomen normal, no hepatosplenomegaly. But what you find is his BMI is 29. I hope you know how to calculate BMI. BMI is your weight divided by your height in meters square. Square of your height in meters. Fine. The BMI of this patient is 29. Is BMI of 29 kg per meter square normal? Okay. Give me more answers. Is the BMI of 29 kg per meter square normal? Yeah. So he falls into the obese category, overweight obese category. Fine. It's not normal BMI. Now, what do you think is your most likely diagnosis? After the history, after the examination, would you like to change your diagnosis of diabetes mellitus, or would you like to continue with this? So most of you would like to stick to the diagnosis of diabetes mellitus. Fine. Now, the pointers that I gave you in this case to make a diagnosis work, and you have to approach all cases this way. This is not just for your clinical case discussion. This is for when you guys, whenever you guys have a patient, you always have to give importance to history. The most important thing in treating a patient, whatever branch it is the history, because that is what is giving you the main thing. So you have to pick out all the pointers that help you reach a diagnosis. So in this case, what the pointers that I gave you were a 45-year-old male. So the onset of diabetes type 2 is generally after 40 years. Fine. I gave you the history of alcoholism. That is again a risk factor for the diabetes to develop. Now look at his presenting complaints. Blurred vision since 3 days. This patient would not have come to the OPD only if he didn't have blurred vision, because other symptoms were since 1 month, right? Frequent urination, increased hunger. उसे लगा होगा भूख थोड़ी ज्यादा लग रही है, मेहनत ज्यादा की है. So he did not come to the OPD for that. He came to the OPD for blurred vision since 3 days because that was what was hampering his normal activity, daily activity. Fine. So he came for that. Now he also then told he has increased thirst since 2 weeks. He has fatigue. Now fatigue is likely because as we discussed, insulin is not acting, so the glucose in his body cannot be utilized. He also gave the classical history of frequent urination, increased hunger, increased thirst. Now unintended weight loss. He's on one hand he's saying increased hunger. On one hand, he's saying he also has weight loss. So this should click a trigger in your mind that this is most likely a diabetic patient who has not yet been diagnosed. Fine. And also the most important thing, even you guys have to take care. If anybody in your family is diabetic or diabetes runs in your family or your parents, your mother or your grandparents, uncles, aunts, anybody, please be extra cautious. If you have any symptoms, if your parents have any symptoms, your relatives, friends, anybody has symptoms, please get them tested at the earliest because diabetes partly is a hereditary thing. Fine. So I gave you the history of diabetes with his father and his uncle. On examination, the findings, his blood pressure was mildly increased. What is the normal blood pressure range that a person should have, a normal healthy adult should have? You guys are going to your clinical postings, right? Yeah, this is a first year question, yeah. Physiology of what is it? 120/80. बिल्कुल ideal. और come on, I want more answers. What is the normal blood pressure? 100 to 140 to 60 to 90. Okay, a good, like you gave a range. Any other answers? What is the normal blood pressure of an adult, a healthy normal adult? Come on, this is a first year question. So basically there's a range. 120/80 is the ideal value which you take as a reference. The normal range is from 100 to 130. The systolic blood pressure and the diastolic is between 60 to 90. Fine. So always remember this. You guys go to your clinical postings. तो किसी भी 125 वाले को hypertensive मत बोल देना. 126, 124 जिसका भी blood pressure हो, is not hypertensive. There's a cut off. There are standard guidelines which these global organizations, WHO and all have made. Fine. So 130 तक we consider it normotensive. ठीक है? और 90 तक भी diastolic blood pressure is considered normotensive. तो वार्ड में जाके किसी का बीपी अगर 128/76 आ गया तो उसको हाइपरटेंसिव नहीं बोलना, he is normotensive. But in our case, this patient, he has become mildly hypertensive because his blood pressure is 135/86. Fine. His respiratory rate, what is the normal respiratory rate of a normal adult? It's generally 12 to 16. In this case, it's towards the upper limit. It's 15 per minute. So this patient is also mildly tachypnic, not tachypnea, classical definition, but he has increased respiratory rate. The other thing was BMI, which I told you guys that BMI, he is in overweight category because it's 29 kgs. So that is another indication to our diagnosis of diabetes mellitus. Now we proceed to see what the investigations of this patient is. Now you all have to think like doctors. You're sitting in OPD, fine. This patient has come to you. He doesn't know anything about diabetes. He's an undiagnosed, unknown case. First time presenting to you. Now you've made this diagnosis. What all investigations would you like to do? So I want to know from you guys what all you think you should get done in this patient. FBG, VPBG, HbA1c. Okay, good. What all other investigations would you like to do? Urine RM, blood sugar, HbA1c, good. And okay, I'm getting good answers. And I want some more answers. You are his doctor. What all will you advise him? भैया जाके ये टेस्ट करा के लेके आओ. क्या बोलोगे? Urine RM, blood sugar, HbA1c. I'm getting good answers. Random RBS, CBC. Okay. Any other test that you think of is relevant in the situation with the complaints that he had? eye examination. Exactly. I was waiting for this answer. So this patient has only presented because he had blood vision since 3 days. He was not bothered about his increased thirst, increased urination, increased hunger, any whatsoever. He only came because this is eye examination. That's a very important part in diabetic patients, be it type 1, type 2, whatever type of diabetes it is, eye examination is very important. So now let's see what we did in this patient. So CBC was done. His hemoglobin was 39%, TLC was 8,460 per mm cube, KD 2.8, RBC is normocytic normochromin, CBC was normal. Fine. Now comes the interesting part. A random blood glucose was done with a finger prick done by the medicine PG in the OPD, and the value was 265. Now tell me what the value of RBS should be in a normal patient. What is the cutoff for a random blood sugar level? Classify it as normal. Less than 200. Any other answers? Okay, I'm getting an answer of 140. So yeah, a random blood glucose, whenever you guys become interns, always remember a random blood glucose, irrespective of when the patient has had food, whatever time has passed after he has had food, a random blood glucose level less than 140 is normal. 140 is the cutoff, above which everything is abnormal. Fine. So this PG resident of medicine, he did this RBS sitting in the OPD and it was 265. Now further this patient was given a set of investigations to be done. So the fasting blood glucose came out to be 188. What is the normal fasting blood glucose? $6,200. Yeah, fine. So most of you know the correct value. So fasting blood glucose level should be 6,200 milligrams per deciliter. In this case, it was 188 milligrams per deciliter. So another red flag. Now, postprandial blood glucose. What is the normal value of postprandial blood glucose? 125 to 140. 100 to 140. और क्या क्या आंसर्स देखे भाई बताओ. So there's a window between when there's this WHO classification of categorizing diabetes. So up to 110, like 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter is considered for fasting. After a value of 100 and more than 110 to 125 is taken as impaired glucose tolerance. Any value of fasting more than 126 milligrams per deciliter is considered as diabetes. Fine. In case of postprandial, anything above 140 is diabetes. So most of you have written it correctly. So in our case, this was 372 milligrams per deciliter. Now we did a urine RM, which most of you also advised to this patient. So glucose was 2+, proteins had microalbuminuria present, ketones negative, specific gravity increased mildly. So this corresponds to our diagnosis of diabetes. All these changes we discussed in the beginning of our lecture, all these changes are seen in diabetes. His HbA1c was 8%. Now you tell me what is the normal value of HbA1c and what is exactly HbA1c? What is HbA1c? Glycated hemoglobin. Okay, excellent. What is the normal value of HbA1c? Yeah, Sheetal, correct. Non-enzymatic attachment of glucose to hemoglobin. Yeah, very good. Khyati, good. Ankit, Bhuvan. So the normal value is, as Shashwat has correctly mentioned, it's less than 5.7. for a diabetic to control his diabetes, the value should remain less than 6.5. That is called a good glycemic control in a diabetic patient. Okay. So don't get confused with 6.5. The correct value is less than 5.7%. Okay. And for a diabetic, in a known case of diabetes, a good glycemic control is when his HbA1c level is less than 6.5. Fine, clear? I hope there is no confusion now. Okay. Now coming back to the case, his LFT was normal, his KFT was normal. Now, this is what I was talking about. There is a diagnostic criteria for diabetes, which is given by the WHO and the International Diabetes Federation. Fine. So in this case, this was what I was talking about. The diagnosis of diabetes is made when fasting plasma glucose is more than 126 milligrams per deciliter. When 2-hour plasma glucose after an OGTT or a meal, as you can say, is more than 200. Random is more than 200 for a diagnosis of, we are only talking about a diagnosis of diabetes. And glycosylated hemoglobin is more than 6.5. This is only the criteria for diagnosis of diabetes. We are not talking about normal, we are not talking about impaired. Fine. So this is only for diabetes mellitus. So in our case, a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus type 2 was made. Now, what were the additional investigations that were ordered was a lipid profile. Why lipid profile is important, I'll tell you. A fundoscopic examination. Fundoscopic examination basically means an eye examination. Fundus is another term used for your retinal examination. So when you guys come to your next prof, you will learn in your ophtha that how a fundoscopy examination is done. So that is, they evaluate your retina, because in diabetics, eyes are the most important organs that are affected the earliest, and signs can be seen. So in case anybody of you has a diabetic at home or knows somebody who's a diabetic, they should regularly get their eyes checked every 3 months preferably, and they should look out for cataracts, they should look out for any changes in the vision, any blurring of vision. So this you have to keep in mind. Fine. And an ECG was advised. Now, why lipid profile is important in this case is because if the lipid profile is abnormal, it is associated with an increased risk of coronary artery disease. So you might have heard a lot of cases where people are diabetic since long and lipid profile is not maintained. And what happens is they suffer a heart attack out of the blue. So that is why it's important to control your lipid profile. So what happens is, in this case, is the usual pattern in diabetes type 2 is your triglycerides increase, your HDL, that is the good cholesterol, that decreases, and the bad cholesterol, that is LDL, that increases. Fine. Now, also of significance in my previous slide was that your urine showed microalbuminuria. So, are proteins generally secreted in urine? Are proteins normally present in the urine that we excrete? That is my question. So I want you to answer that. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of mixed responses. Somebody saying no, somebody saying yes, somebody saying secreted but not detectable. Yes, but in very minute amounts. Okay. Any other opinion? Are proteins normally secreted in urine in a normal adult? So the answer is that protein is secreted in the form of albumin. So there's a normal albumin excretion which is less than 30 milligrams in 24 hours of urine. So that is absolutely normal. You never say that proteins are not secreted in urine. So this is a viva question again for all of you. Even in your future, in your medicine, in your pediatrics, you will be asked this question. So there is excretion of proteins in urine in the form of albumin, and the normal value is considered is less than 30 milligrams in a 24-hour urine sample. Now, what happens in microalbuminuria? Because this patient had microalbuminuria. So what exactly is microalbuminuria? 30 to 300. Okay, good. Okay, so most of you know the correct answer. So what microalbuminuria is? When albumin is excreted below the level of detection by a routine dipstick. The reagent strip test that I showed you is also called a routine dipstick test. Fine. So it is not detected by that, but when you quantify it in a 24-hour urine sample, for microalbuminuria, the definition is 30 to 300 milligrams in 24 hours urine sample, which most of you have correctly mentioned. Now, what is the significance of this microalbuminuria? Okay, wait. Before that, what is overt albuminuria? So now that we know that normal is less than 30 milligrams in 24 hours, microalbuminuria is 30 to 300. So overt albuminuria is excretion of albumin more than 300 milligrams in 24-hour urine sample. Fine. So this definition, this cutoff should be very clear with all of you. Overt albuminuria more than 300 milligrams in a day. Fine. So now this urine examination becomes of importance in a diabetic patient. Why? Because diabetes mellitus is a leading cause of renal failure. And diabetic nephropathy, which you must have learned in your kidney chapter, all the changes, all the Kimmel-Wilson lesion and everything, they develop in at least 30% patients of be it type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So what happens is, along with this, diabetic nephropathy develops hypertension. So this patient of ours also had hypertension, if you could correlate. Mildly hypertensive Niklas had this patient. He also had microalbuminuria. So you never know, although his KFT was normal, but you never know early diabetic nephropathy changes might have started in this patient. So how can we prevent it? The best way to prevent is early detection. Because in early stages, what happens is this diabetic nephropathy is partly reversible early if you catch it early. So how do we detect this? Is by estimation of urine albumin. So that is where the significance of this albumin excretion comes, and that is why it's so important in diabetic patients. Fine. So also, if there's increase this thing, diabetic nephropathy and everything, cardiovascular accidents can take place, BP will increase, and also poor glycemic control will happen in this patient. So in case of any diabetes type 2 patient, the screening for urine albumin is to be done at the time of diagnosis and is to be done at regular intervals. Fine. So whenever you see a patient of diabetes type 2 in your OPDs, in your future, in your clinics, when you go to your clinical postings, whenever a new case of diabetes is diagnosed, immediately the urine examination is done. Urine albumin values are taken into consideration because the early detection can prevent the development of diabetic nephropathy and further renal failure. Fine. Now, other methods apart from urinary albumin excretion in a 24-hour urine sample is the albumin to creatinine ratio in a random sample. So imagine if the patient is very debilitated or something and he cannot collect a 24-hour urine sample. So what we do is an albumin to creatinine ratio in a random urine sample. So that is another option which they might ask you in Viva. Right. So let's go ahead. Now, imagine you are the doctor again. Now, how will you manage this patient? So the major components of treatment of diabetes are first and foremost lifestyle modifications, which is diet and exercise, which every patient has to do. Oral hypoglycemic agents, which are also called OHAs, about which you study in your pharmacology, your drugs, and then comes your insulin therapy. And the last and the most important thing, which you as budding doctors also have to tell your diabetic relatives and friends and grandparents and everybody, and also to patients. Also, if you know anybody who's a diabetic, you please teach them this. The patient education and self-care of the patient is of utmost importance in diabetes. Right? We'll discuss about this. So what happens is there's a diabetic diet. Fine. So normally when you guys study PSM, we have 50 to 60% of carbs, 50 to 25% of protein, and the rest is fibers and sorry, rest is fibers. So what happens in a diabetic diet? The portioning changes. Only 25% is carbohydrates, 25% is protein, rest is all fibers, vegetables. Now again, the importance of diet, exercise, regular monitoring of blood glucose. This is how your metformin tablets look like. This is an insulin vial, a biphasic isophene insulin injection, which you will see in your wards when you go for your clinical postings. You'll have to give this to your patients as interns, and insulin is dosed. So never ever give insulin to a patient without knowing on what dose he is, how many units he is receiving, and at what time he is receiving. So this is a very sensitive thing to give. Always ask your advice from your seniors about how to give this and what dose to give. Okay. Now, insulin delivery devices, just so that you are familiar, this is the most common. This is an insulin syringe, the first one. You can see this in wards. This is how insulin is administered in wards over here. These are more advanced products. This is an insulin pen. This is basically for self-administration, mostly used by type 1 diabetes mellitus people. This is a jet injector, same principle as an insulin pen, and this is an insulin pump. Now, what happens is in this insulin pump, this is connected to your belt or your kept in your pocket, this black device, and it's connected to a pipe-like thing, a pipette-like thing, a narrow, very pipe-like thing, and this white taped portion, it is implanted into your skin. So this dosing of insulin, just so that there is no human manual error, the dosing is fixed by the doctor in this device, and at regular intervals, insulin is secreted into the blood of the patient. Fine. So the patient compliance is very good in insulin pump. Now that we're discussing about self-care, what is of most importance is that patients should be educated about all the danger signs of this disease. Fine. And he should be given the responsibility to control his own diabetes. His efforts along with the doctor's efforts, both are required to manage this disease. Fine. And diabetes, as we all know, is not curable, but it's a 100% manageable disease. You can totally control it. So what the patient has to be educated about is blood glucose monitoring. So you have to give him the options of how he can monitor his blood glucose. If the patient can afford, he has to buy a glucose monitoring device, a self-prick one. If he cannot, he has to regularly go to a nearby clinic or a hospital or a general practitioner to get his blood glucose done. He has to monitor his body weight. In our case, also, we advise our patient because he comes into the overweight category. He has to manage his body weight. The third thing is foot care. Now, what happens in diabetics is whenever there's an injury, it takes a long time to heal. Why? Because your blood your blood has all these factors which are required for healing and repair and regeneration, but because of increased glucose concentration, it is not done efficiently, so it takes a lot of time. And also because wound is exposed and there is raw surface underneath, so that takes time to heal in diabetics. Because then personal hygiene is of importance because diabetics tend to develop opportunistic infections like skin infections, like candida, everything. They basically become immunocompromised to some extent if they do not control their diabetes. So foot care is important, personal hygiene is important. Then the other thing is your healthy lifestyle in which they have to incorporate exercise. Now, you can't advise these patients to go and become heavy gymmers, but they have to do moderate amount of exercise for a moderate amount of time regularly. That is how they can control it. Right? Now, they have to stop smoking, and obviously they have to abstain from alcohol and reduce the quantity. So that is all that the patients should be made aware of, and they should be also they should be held responsible for controlling their blood sugar level, because ultimately the patient only knows what he's eating, what he's exercising, and what he's doing. Fine. So these are the glucose monitoring devices. This lecture is just to orient you practically about how we manage it in the real life scenarios. So this is a glucometer. You must have all seen it. So with people who have grandparents and parents at home who have diabetes, they must have all used it also. So this is how you do it. This is a prick. This is a capillary action. The blood is sucked in. It's an electronic device. It detects your blood glucose level. So this is how it's done. Now this is a continuous glucose monitoring device. It's used for people mostly in type 1 diabetes because they have to calculate their insulin doses accordingly. So it's connected to a smart device or a smartphone, and this patch is attached to your skin, detects your and you can notice your blood glucose levels continuously on your smart device. Fine. Now coming back to our case. Now, what all the advice was given by the doctor after the investigation was, yes, he had to make lifestyle modifications. He had to reduce his weight. He had to bring back his BMI to normal. He had to eat healthy, follow a diabetic diet, restrict his alcohol consumption because he was an alcoholic. He was started on medications, the oral hypoglycemic agents that we discussed, metformin, the first line drug that was given, 500 milligrams BD for 2 weeks. Now you will question me as to why 2 weeks only. This is because we really don't know what dose of metformin will be suitable for the patient to control this hyperglycemia. So the doctors generally give it for a shorter duration, and when the blood glucose levels become stable at some dose of medication, that is the dose that is continued. So you never give a medication for 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, never. For 2 weeks, then the patient is again called back for a follow-up. Right? Self-care was taught to the patient. The danger signs, which we'll discuss further, they were explained to the patient. He was advised to regularly get tested, and he had to follow up with his doctors regularly at frequent intervals. So these last two advices are to be followed with every diabetic person. Be in touch with your doctor, whatever happens, any acute illness, any febrile illness, you need to get tested, you need to inform your doctor. Anything that happens to you, you have to inform your doctor, who's your treating physician, who knows that you're a diabetic. Even in case of COVID, we had seen that diabetics were most badly affected people, and they were the ones who were who had the maximum morbidity also. So that is how careful you have to be with this disease. Now, shortly discussing the complications of diabetes. So broadly categorizing it into acute and chronic. So acute complications can be diabetic ketoacidosis, hypoglycemia, hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. The details of which everything you study in medicine and in pediatrics further. The chronic complications include microvascular and macrovascular. So if there's a question in your exam, you have to answer in these headings. The chronic complications are divided into microvascular and macrovascular. The microvascular ones include retinopathy, which our patient had. Nephropathy, which is again I told you can be prevented by a urine albumin examination. Neuropathy. So there is a particular sign in a diabetic patient of peripheral neuropathy. Can anybody tell me what is it called? Those who posted in medicine must be knowing it. There's a classical term that is used for peripheral neuropathy in a diabetic patient. If anybody could tell me, like it's a high level question, but still, if you guys, anybody knows. Okay. So Sheetal, you're correct. It's called a glove and stocking, not stock. It's a glove and stocking. Why it's a glove and it's not a deformity. It's a glove and stocking neuropathy. Why? Because as I told you, foot care is important in diabetes because peripheral neuropathy starts from the most distal part of your foot. Your nerves get affected. So you must always have seen that a diabetic patient is always given vitamin B12 to prevent this peripheral neuropathy along with all the medications that he's having. So what happens is the area in which you wear your socks up to your ankles, that is where the neuropathy starts. And same for your hands. Till the part where you wear your gloves, that is where the neuropathy is. So the patient starts having tingling sensation, numbness, and then if it gradually progresses, if it's not treated, then the areas become numb. Right? So that is of importance to see. Now, diabetic foot that you see in surgery. There is dermopathy. There are skin changes in diabetes, which you'll again study in derma. So that is important. The macrovascular changes, which are like big vessels are involved, cerebrovascular accidents can happen, cardiovascular accidents can happen, and peripheral vascular diseases can happen. So this is a slide. If a question comes on complications of diabetes, these are the major headings under which you have to answer your question. Fine. Now, hypoglycemia, this is of importance because if you have someone at home who's a diabetic, you always have to look out for hypoglycemia. The most important thing for a diabetic is his family support. the people who know that he has this disease and what the danger signs are and how to treat them. So hypoglycemia is one of the most dangerous signs and one of the most common signs which can happen. So hypoglycemia is the most frequent acute complication. Now symptoms occur when blood glucose levels fall below 60 milligrams per deciliter, and general, what are the very common causes that happen? The patient has missed a meal, patient has forgotten to take his medication, or patient has taken double dose of medication, or he has had alcohol, or as I told you, there are errors in insulin dosage. The patient is having a diabetic diet, but instead of 8, he took 12 units of insulin. So that is what leads to hypoglycemia. So you have to be very careful with this. What happens when a patient has hypoglycemia is autonomic dysfunctions and neurologic dysfunctions. So autonomic dysfunction, obviously patient becomes hungry, but what you can see is he's having tremors, palpitations, anxiety, sweating. So whenever you see this patient, always just try to think of a hypoglycemic episode. Neurological dysfunction is impaired thinking, irritability, headaches, convulsions, can lead to a coma also. Fine. Now, diabetic ketoacidosis, this is a true medical emergency. Now, what happens is in a type 1 diabetes, if you omit insulin or there's increased demand. So, what happens is in cases of infection, trauma, in case of myocardial infarction, stroke, whenever there's a trauma to the body or there's increased stress to the body, in terms of all these points that are mentioned, it can lead to diabetic ketoacidosis, and the mortality rate of diabetic ketoacidosis is around 5%. How does this diabetic ketoacidosis present? The patient starts vomiting, he has stomach pain, rapid breathing, increased pulse, sleepiness, dry mouth, flushed face, and a fruity breath, which is indicative of ketoacidosis. As suggested, ketones are present. Fine. So you have to look out for this. The macrovascular complications are ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular diseases, and the peripheral vascular diseases, as I have told you. And this is of importance because diabetic patients have 2 to 6 times of high risk to develop such cases, to have such accidents. Fine. Now, this is a diagram from Robbins which shows you what all complications are there. So, there can be cerebral vascular infarcts, there can be hemorrhage. In your eyes, there can be retinopathies, cataracts, glaucomas. Hypertension can be there, MIs can be there, atherosclerosis. Now, in your pancreas and type 2 diabetes, there is amyloid deposition, which leads to less secretion of insulin. In cases of kidneys, there can be glomerulosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, pyelonephritis, infections, and diabetics are prone to infections. So they have to take very good care of their personal hygiene, and they have to look out for any infections and everything. So this is what I was talking about, the glove and stocking. This is your hand, the palm of the hand up to the wrist. This is your peripheral neuropathy. In cases of your foot, the diabetic foot infections can develop here until this part of your ankle above your malleolus. That is where you get your peripheral neuropathy in your foot. So that is the glove and stocking. Then there's autonomic neuropathy in your bladder. So basically, diabetes is a disease that affects all the organs of your body ultimately if you don't manage it well. Fine. So these microvascular complications, they occur due to a long-standing hyperglycemia. That is why we say that it's very important to keep your blood glucose levels in control because they can lead to these complications which can ultimately result to be fatal. So, and the most important thing is both type 1 and type 2 diabetes are susceptible to microvascular complications. So, the most important take-home message for you guys is that the duration of the disease and the quality of glycemic control, the diabetic control, are 2 such important determinants of microvascular complications occurring in a patient or not. Fine. Now, a last slide as to how we monitor diabetes as doctors. So, what happens is in an insulin resistance syndrome, that is a diabetic patient, there is central obesity, dyslipidemia, hypertension, insulin resistance, glucose intolerance. We advise them therapeutic lifestyle changes. That is, they have to manage their weight by doing a 5 to 10% weight loss, physical activity 100 to 150 minutes per week. They have to restrict their carbohydrates. They have to monitor their blood glucose. Fine. Then further, for lipid disorders, they have to do their lipid profile. If the lipid profile is deranged, drugs are advised to them for hypertension, BP more than 130/80. Every visit, their blood pressure is monitored. Their target BP is kept less than 130/80. If it's not, then again antihypertensive drugs are advised. If there's hyperglycemia, that is fasting glucose more than 110, then again drugs are OHAs are added for the patient, or the dose is increased as I told you. Now additional treatment considerations to be here are to prevent cardiovascular accidents. Low dose aspirin, ACE inhibitors are given. Tobacco cessation and alcohol cessation, most important, is advised to the patient. Now, the most important things again: manage your weight and BMI, monitor and lower your blood pressure, cholesterol. 30 minutes of activities 5 days a week, or as I told you, 100 to 150 minutes per week is required. Okay, eating a healthy diet, less fats, more fiber, more reducing your carbohydrates, and quitting smoking is important. Now, this is of importance. Today is 8th November, but after 6 days, on 14th November, we celebrate World Diabetes Day. This is the symbol for that, so that this can come as your question in your entrance exam, PG entrance exam and everything, MCQs. So this is just for your knowledge. So 14th November, we celebrate World Diabetes Day. So the last slide for my class today, that as budding doctors, you have the onus to recognize these signs and symptoms in your grandparents, parents, relatives, or any elderly person or any patient that you come across, and get them consulted with a doctor immediately. So whenever you see a patient, or whenever you get to a family gathering and somebody complains that I have frequent urination, I have tingling and numbness, I have weight loss, I have frequent hunger, I get injuries and they don't heal so fast as they used to. You always look out and think on the terms of a diabetes mellitus present in those individuals. Fine. Thank you. Any questions you may please ask. I have already overshot my time by 15 minutes, but any questions? Most welcome. This was not a lecture. This was basically to practically orient you to how we treat diabetes in real life scenarios, how we deal with patients. Any questions? Or should we call it a day? Ma'am, how weight loss and obesity present simultaneously as in this case? See, what happens is, that is the pathophysiology of diabetes, which ma'am must have covered in her lecture previously. See, what happens is, there is presence, see, the glucose gets absorbed from your intestine and goes into your blood. But what happens is the insulin is not able to act on your cells to get the glucose inside the cells. So although there is presence of increased glucose, the body is unable to utilize it. So what it does is, it starts feeling hungry. So it starts feeling hungry, although it has had food. So that is what leads to obesity, because ultimately your glucose is not utilized, it is being converted to fats, and fat is being stored. On the other hand, your body is not using glucose, so it becomes like it has fatigue, it has tiredness, it has everything. There is central obesity. The muscles and everything, they start getting utilized, the proteins in the muscles and everything. And the central obesity, the fat deposition starts around your abdomen and everything. So that is why there is presence of obesity in the same patient, central obesity to be precise. And there is also weight loss by loosening of clothes from your arms and your bottom wear and everything. They start getting loose and you start getting a beer belly sort of thing. That is what happens. Ultimately, it comes down to non-utilization of glucose, so that is increased glucose, so that gets converted to fats and everything, and that gets stored. Any other question? I hope I have cleared your doubt.